Welcome back. Thank you so much for coming back to session number 2. Did everyone enjoy Chris's talk? Conservation and the education of conservation and biology comes obviously in lots of different layers. I just think that wholly scientific approach, if we are going to start to really understand and get our heads around and act upon the declines of everything that he spoke about, and obviously the species that Brittany and I are going to talk about, you need that level of detail. And I think the BTO do a lot more than I think people realise. Is anyone here a member of the BTO at all? A few people? Yeah. Great organisation. So if you can support them, please do. Anyway, so yeah, welcome back to session 2. So between myself and Brittany, I'll do some full intros in a minute. We're going to really kind of talk about what's been happening in and around this landscape here specifically over the last, decade, give or take, and the impacts that it's beginning to have, mostly positive, and why we feel it should grow and evolve in the way and on the trajectory that it's currently going, and how that can then influence a whole range of people, starting from other conservation NGOs, landowners, right up to government level, and the will that we feel, that we're hearing from people like yourselves, the reasons why nature recovery is also not just benefiting ecosystems, but the massive public benefits it's also having as well. So between Brittany and myself, we're going to kind of cover these topics over the next 3 or 4 hours, just because it's so nice to talk about it. So I'll just do a really quick intro. So my name's Paul. I'm one of the co-founders of Birds of Poole Harbour with Mark and Mo, who are sat down here on the right-hand side. And between us is Carey here as well. And Carey, so between the 4 of us, we co-founded Birds of Poole Harbour back in 2000 and, became a registered charity in 2013. But really came and formed as a group back in 2012 with not much of a plan, did we? Well, I did have a plan, but initially, it was to really kind of start assessing Poole Harbour as a whole. Obviously, there are great conservation NGOs within the harbour, RSPB, National Trust, Dorset Wildlife Trust, but no one was assessing Poole Harbour as a full ecosystem, really. So one of the things we wanted to do was get our head around that, and really quite naturally, different opportunities evolved and grew into what we've kind of accomplished today, which has been really, really nice. And then when we were 2 years into establishing the charity, completely by chance, I got an email in my inbox one day by a gentleman called Steve Gilbert, who was my old science teacher at Litchett Minster School. And as kind of fate often has it, he had moved from Litchett Minster School and was now teaching at Parkstone Grammar School. And he contacted me knowing that, we'd set up Birds of Poole Harbour and that we were into conservation. He said, look, you might be interested in this, but I've got this student called Brittany, and for fun, what was the actual name of the qualification?
An extended project qualification, something you do during your A-levels to get some practice on essay writing. That
sums it up, doesn't it? And he contacted us and said, I've got this student called Brittany, and she has just written this document based on osprey recovery and reintroductions. And this was way before we'd even considered doing a reintroduction of ospreys here in Poole Harbour. And he sent me through the document, and it was supposed to be how many words?
4,000.
And how many was it?
20,000.
And it blew me away. I just thought, wow, okay, this is really, really interesting. And just, it was so interesting because at that time, actually, we were looking to try and gauge a better understanding of how ospreys were using Poole Harbour on migration, which they were, and numbers were building. So we actually invited Brittany, whilst you were still finishing your A-levels, weren't you, to come and help us just do some volunteer monitoring. So Brittany set up a monitoring scheme, and the rest, as they say, is history. Is that how you remember it?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. I was very, very, very lucky to come into contact with the people I did at that stage. And I think I always say that success is a combination of hard work and luck. I think that rings true for a lot of the stuff we're going to talk about today as well.
Look at that. What I really love about Birds of Poole Harbour is, on the most part, we are a group of enthusiastic, very engaged, driven individuals. Everyone within the charity absolutely lives and breathes what they do, and we couldn't ask for any more, really. But what's really nice, Brittany and I, both local. I mean, I grew up in Poole Harbour, spent my whole life utterly obsessed, initially with herpetology, so snakes, reptiles, frogs' toes. My bedroom was full of animals. To the point where I even won Young Herpetologist of the Year 1994. Yeah, thanks. Finally, the admiration. And without a shadow of a doubt, I mean, my favourite habitats that I love spending time on is the Dorset Heathlands, and we're so fortunate here around the harbour to just have this massive diversity of landscapes and biodiversity.
Oh, sorry. And yeah, it's a very similar story for me. I was very fortunate. I grew up in Stowborough, so just the other side of Wareham. And you can't help but be enthusiastic about this landscape when you live in it. And Paul and I have both really just let that kind of flow through our work. But we've got a whole fantastic team around us now. Ooh. Oh, should we talk about sorry, this is unprofessionalism coming through. Should we talk about a little bit about what actually Birds of Poole Harbour stands for? So this is our colleague Liv. Many of you will know Liv. She's on maternity leave at the moment, but she has really led this bringing together of what Birds of Poole Harbour is and having a clear vision statement for the charity, because all the things that Paul and I have just talked about, the things that drive us day to day, we realised we hadn't really actually articulated it and put it into a clear set of instructions and a clear communication to people of what we actually do and why we do it. And so inspiring hope for nature was the phrase that we arrived on. And, our core values, it's about being kind and authentic. It's also about being ambitious and very effective. And we always say, because we're a small team, we really do try to be very effective. But the team is growing. So we've now got how many members of staff, Paul?
9 in a couple of weeks.
So you've got Sam up in the top corner there. He's in I think a lot of them are in the civic centre.
Then go on.
It feels a bit violent today. So Sam, who's leading up the events team. We've got Laura, who's now our charity manager. Ooh, exciting. Congratulations, Laura, on that. Carey, obviously, who we've already met. And our colleague Neve, who was also around in the office during the time when we established. Myself, Joe, who's just come back. Joe was here earlier, but he's had to run off and go and do an event. Joe did a 2.5-year stint on Lundy, but he's now back. Liv, we've got Georgie, who, if you've ever communicated with us online, then you'll have spoken to Georgie. Maya, who's on the events team as well. Helen's just joined us to help with the accounts. And of course, Mark and Mo. And we've also got a couple of other trustees, Ian Alexander and Sam. And so we've got a really fantastic team to be able to, we hope, deliver some really effective change for wildlife locally and for people as well. And the first of those things, really the thing we're probably most well known for, of course, is the ospreys. Do you want me to do ospreys, Paul?
You start.
I'll do ospreys. The other thing I didn't introduce about myself, I'm a PhD student at the moment at Bournemouth University, studying the population ecology of ospreys up in Scotland. Very kindly supported by Mark and Mo through the charity. So this is, if you've got any osprey questions, feel free to direct them to me. Many of you will know that we did a reintroduction of ospreys locally starting in 2017 here in Poole Harbour. We're going to talk to you about a lot of species this morning, and some of them, like ospreys, really struggle to get back into landscapes on their own. It's quite surprising for such a big bird that they're going to, they're flying through Poole Harbour every spring and autumn, and yet none of them were choosing to stop and settle. There's some really key parts of their ecology that explain that, mostly that they like to nest where they were born, natal phylopatry, and they like to nest near other individuals of the same species. That's conspecific attraction. And it basically means that if you want to get them back in a landscape, certainly within decades, from which they've been lost for centuries, sometimes you need some interventions. It's just another approach to conservation. It can, there's some mixed feelings about translocations, but we very strongly advocate for them when they're used in the right place. And this certainly seemed like the right approach for the ospreys. So these young birds, these are about, at this stage, are about 8 or 9 weeks old. They're taken from population in Scotland. We reared them in release pens, actually on site here at Careys, certainly between in 2019 and 2021, just down on the floodplain behind where Poole is now. And we released them. In total, over the course of 4 years, we released 24 males and 14 females into the landscape. They're a migratory species. They go to the same areas of West Africa that Chris was talking about, the Gambia, Guinea-Bissau, Senegal. So they're only with us for about 14 weeks in the UK before they then make that journey completely solo. And that's one of the reasons that we translocate so many of them, is that actually a very small proportion of those are actually going to survive to come back, unfortunately. But we did translocate 38, we released 38 in total. You can see there's a slight bias towards males. That's because they're the ones that are most likely to actually come back to Poole Harbour itself, because of that natal philopatry they exhibit. And sure enough, our very first breeding pair came back in, they established themselves over the course of many years. This is CJ7. She's nothing to do with our project at all. She turned up the very first year that we released ospreys into the landscape here. She just happened to be passing through, a young female exploring, and she found 8 young ospreys that we'd released into the landscape, and we tricked her into thinking, by accident entirely, into thinking that there was a really healthy population of ospreys locally. And about 6 years later, she actually became the first breeding female osprey in southern England since 1847, and she paired up with 022, who was one of the males we released in 2019. And if you come back here, hopefully in just over a month's time, we really hope that you'll be able to go up on the platform, which you may have seen as you drove in this morning, and actually go and see that nest site. The first year they bred here, I should have said the nest itself is on site here at Careys as well. The first year they bred here, we didn't publicise it at all. We kept it very quiet because we wanted to ensure that they had the chance to settle without disturbance at this site. But these birds, yes, the main aim of the project is to restore the species, but also these birds play a very pivotal role in terms of connecting people with nature as well. And we felt that if there was a way that we could safely provide opportunities for people to come and see these birds, that we really wanted to do it, because it's such an important story for us to be able to tell. And so, we'll be running osprey tours again this summer if anyone would like to come and see the ospreys. It's a really remarkable thing to see, and they've surprised us in a lot of ways. The productivity, the legacy of the project has been phenomenal. So from the 38 birds that we released, only 7 of those actually returned, 3 males and 4 females. One of those males died. As Mark likes to point out all the time, all of the females have gone to Wales, which is why you can see on this graph here of all of the young that have become like progeny of that project, there's quite a large proportion of them are actually in Wales. Now, some of those, the progeny of those progeny, I hope will come back in future years and actually come back into our population. So it's certainly not... Mark was very cross when they all went to Wales, but I'm sure when one of 014's chicks comes and breeds in Dorset, I think all will be forgiven. But what's really remarkable, this is the Carey nest last year. CJ7 and 022 on their own have produced 11 chicks just over the course of 4 years. Now, most osprey nests, they will lay 3 eggs. 3 or 2 of them will hatch, and on average, probably just over 2 of them will survive to fledging, and then only 30% of those young come back. But CJ7 and 022 for the last 2 years have reared 4 chicks successfully to fledging. So not only have they laid those 4 eggs, they've reared all those young as well successfully. And you can see in this video here, there's so much food. 022 is such an effective hunter that there's actually a spare fish lying in the nest here while all of the chicks are fed by the 2 adults. That poor mullet is just... there's no positive end for that mullet, sadly, but it is absolutely vital. And I think it's really lovely. One of the criticisms we had when we started this project was that people didn't think that some of these species are very well suited to human-dominated landscapes. A lot of the species we're going to talk to you about, certainly ospreys, eagles, they're very much seen as a species of the highlands and very remote parts of the country. But these species can not only survive in human landscapes, they can thrive. They've got a better productivity here in Poole Harbour than they have up in Scotland so far. Obviously, we've got a small sample size, but
I think one of the really interesting things, so in the first year in 2022 they raised 2 youngsters, then 3, and then 4 and 4. And one of the things we worried about when they laid 4 was, okay, well, are all 4 eggs going to hatch? And if they do, is there going to be enough food? And you can see the size difference. I mean, look at this one on the far right compared to this one on the far left just here. And I mean, that's a week, isn't it? I think that's a week's difference between the 2. And I mean, it could be to do with the fact that at the moment, or at that time, that pair were the only pair in Poole Harbour raising young. But like Brittany said, they are such effective parents, CJ7 and 022, that food has never, ever been an issue, and which is why they've been successful with 4 chicks last year and the year before.
And that has a lot to do with them as individuals, obviously. Like 022 is very good. His role is going and catching the fish. CJ7, from the day she lays the eggs until the chicks approach fledging, she will not leave the nest site. She stays there the whole time. Her job is guarding the nest site. And she has offered such effective protection that all 4 of those chicks, they haven't been predated. They've been well protected right up to that stage. But it's also important to consider the quality of the habitat as well. Those fish, 022, he'll fly from here down in that direction to Poole Harbour. It takes him about 10-15 minutes to get to the Wareham Channel, and usually within half an hour he's come back. So he's catching, usually probably on the first attempt at trying to catch a fish, he's catching every time. And that's, again, he's a good quality bird, but there's a good availability of food available for them in this landscape. And so it's a no-brainer, really, and it's really encouraging to be able to showcase this firsthand, that these birds are doing really, really well in this landscape. And so this in itself, if this was the only thing to come out of this project, we would be so absolutely thrilled. But obviously what we're trying to do is build a self-sustaining, healthy population, not just here in Poole Harbour, but right along the south coast, and help the species recover its whole range. And I'm very happy that we are starting to see progress towards that as well. And it might seem, we started this project in 2017. That seems like quite a long time, until only last year we got the second breeding pair in southern England. But they're a very long-lived species. They don't breed until they're at least 3 years old. But once they are set up and breeding somewhere, some individuals can live to 25 years old. So we're very hopeful that both of these pairs are going to do well into the future. This second nest was very, very exciting. Again, it's one of the translocated males, so a male called 374 that we collected from Scotland and released in the local area. He paired up with another female from Rutland, just like CJ7. So we're seeing this really good connectivity between the populations. Our females going to Wales, Rutland females coming down to our population. And I had the privilege last year of finally ringing my first ever osprey chick, which was very exciting to be able to ring those chicks. All of the chicks in our population are currently ringed, and that's quite common across the UK, to help with and they were sort of fitted with these, the codes that we keep saying, 022, CJ7. They're called Darvik rings. They're plastic and they can be read in the field and allow you to track the life history of individual birds, which, as Chris was talking about, is a really powerful tool in terms of our understanding of the species, but also the conservation of them as well. So that nest has had 2 chicks last year. Very good chance. We're hoping both of those birds come back. They've shown, really good quality breeders this year. It's quite common for first-time breeders to only produce 2 young, and then hopefully the following year they'll produce some additional ones. And then another really exciting piece of news that we got last year was that 5H1, the very first osprey chick fledged in southern England in 200 years, is now breeding herself. So the first of CJ7 and 022's chicks to come back. She's breeding up. She's gone back to where her mum's from. So she's done the opposite movement that CJ7's done. She's gone back up to the Midlands. She's paired up with a male from Rutland. And quite incredibly, for her first breeding season, she produced 3 really good quality chicks. And Sam and I had the privilege of going to help bring those chicks as well, which was a very special moment.
Although you were late, weren't you?
We got there with 0 minutes to spare. They'd ringed 2 of the chicks and we got to do the third one.
So why is all this important? We're going to talk about a second species, and the theme for this talk is nature recovery, and obviously that comes in lots of different forms, and we're going to kind of touch on each of those topics in a minute. But what we're kind of really trying to highlight with all of this is also the change in attitudes and the kind of the aspirations, not of just the conservation community, but also of, the public. And so we've got 2 phenomena, and this is why it's been so special this last 10 years especially. In fact, I'd even argue the last 5 years, because so much has changed in this landscape over the last 5 years, for lots and lots of different reasons, that kind of highlight why nature recovery is so important and how it happens, the mechanics, the behind the scenes elements to it as well. And what we're able to do now with quite a lot of ease, is show thousands and thousands of people what species recovery actually looks like. We heard it in Chris's talk, and it becomes so easy for declines to just become statistics. You say it enough times, and actually 99% decline doesn't really often mean very much. I mean, how do you feel about that? It just becomes numbers. And until you see it, which, we do, because we don't have the nightingales in the landscapes, and we don't have the turtle doves and things like that. And it feels like what a lot of people are looking for is the positive reverse of all of those issues, and to be able to experience it and feel it and see it and smell it, whatever, in real time. And of course, in basically perfect conjunction with the ospreys establishing in 2022, our partners in that project, the Roy Dennis Wildlife Foundation and then Forestry England as well, started the White-tailed Eagle project in 2019. And what has kind of evolved with that has gone beyond our wildest dreams, really. I mean, it was always said, when we were talking to Tim and Roy about this back in 2015, 16, 17, I remember Tim, who was obviously coming to speak this afternoon, he said, yeah, you will get eagles visiting the harbour without a doubt. And I just took it as that, really. That occasionally we might get one or two birds pop in, and it might be a 3, 4, 5 occurrence in a year, thing that would happen. But of course, last year, for the first time in almost 300 years, white-tailed eagles nested in Dorset. We very kindly get access to all of the data. So Roy Dennis Foundation and Forest England allow us to kind of see what the birds are up to. Last week, there were 11 eagles in the landscape. Pretty much all of the birds that have been released as part of that translocation project have visited Poole Harbour at one time or another. Sometimes for just a few hours, sometimes a few days, months, years, and in other instances the birds are staying to now breed. And last year it was historical. It was a huge moment. So for the first time, the adult kind of pair that a lot of you might have seen from the boats themselves, G466 the female and G463 the male, they raised the youngster for the first time, which fledged, and we had the privilege to go and see the chick, go and G834, get it tagged. All of the birds, for their protection and for their safety, are tagged. And it was a huge moment. So not only last year did white-tailed eagles breed in Dorset, the ospreys bred for the 4th time. And when we started the charity back in 2012, if someone had said within that time period, both those things would be happening, I would have laughed in your face. Honestly, I would have said, no way. Because not only financially, but also politically, a lot of these things are very, very difficult to get going. And obviously white-tailed eagle projects have been proposed in England in other areas before, a few decades ago, and they all got turfed out because they were deemed too contentious. They were going to eat all the livestock, and we always joked, the dogs and the children. But there are lobby groups out there that push that. It's ridiculous. So in a very short space of time, and now there's no getting away. These are obviously two very big, sexy species, and I'll touch on it at the end. But what we have to do is change our mentality, and or some areas need to change our mentality and views on these such projects, because the positives and the impacts that they have far outweigh the negatives, in our opinion. And we'll kind of touch on those in a bit. Do you want to do beavers?
We can talk about beavers. So what we wanted to do today is not just talk about our own work, but all the other good work that's going on locally, because the truth is that what's happening in South Purbeck right now, in Poole Harbour, across East Dorset, I would say is one of the most exciting movements in the whole of conservation nationally, if not in, across Europe as well. There's some really significant work going on locally here that's experimental, that's very advanced, that is leading the way. And a really good example of that is the beavers over at Littlesea at Studland. Has anyone been to see the beavers? Anyone had the privilege of actually spotting them? Fantastic. There are opportunities to go and see them if you would like to. They've actually moved around a little bit. They've moved their lodge. This is the site. This is one of the kits that they had the very first year that they bred. It's a bit of a mixed story, because I'll tell you first what was really phenomenal was that it was the first legal beaver release in the whole of England. And this is the Environment Secretary, I believe, and one of the local MPs coming and helping do that release. It was featured on national television, and it was something that they fought for locally. The National Trust and Natural England, certainly, they fought for this project for 6 years. So they brought all the stakeholders together. They brought all the research together, and they had actually very broad universal support locally for this project. There was a very small number of people that were against it. They did a lot of very good work with the local farming community to, listen to their concerns and help, demonstrate to them how they would assist them in the future if the beavers were to have an impact. And the only thing that was holding them up was they needed sign-off at the government level. So they needed the Environment Secretary at the time, who was Careys, to sign it off. And she said publicly that her proudest moment was stopping beavers from being released in her own constituency. So there was absolutely no chance of that. But as soon as there was a change of government, there was a more sympathetic Environment Secretary, they were able to get this law passed for legal wild releases of beavers. And the law was signed on Thursday, and the following Wednesday they released these individuals. So they were so ready to go. They were so ambitious, and hats off to them. We were just in awe of the teams that were involved in that.
Yeah, I think with beavers, it's a funny one. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding, because it seems that every kind of nature magazine you pick up, someone's talking about releasing beavers in different places around the country. But what I don't think a lot of people realise is that all of them up until this, have been in enclosures. So I wouldn't say it's misleading, because eventually those enclosures will be taken down. But it didn't, there was no more need to do more beaver releases in enclosures for other organisations. What needed to be done was to kind of head on get the licenses for the wild releases, because obviously having them in the wider landscape is what produces the environmental benefits. And so, some of you might not even know, but the reason these are so good to have in the landscape is they are what we call a keystone species and eco-engineer. Everyone's seen how flooded it is in and around Wareham. Now, obviously, what they do won't create that amount of flooding, but what they do is they go into watercourses, into water systems, into ditch systems, and of course will dam up certain areas, which then allows certain areas to become flooded, which boosts invertebrate populations, which boost bird populations, which boost plant populations as well. And quite often, what organisations will spend either hundreds of thousands of pounds doing, or sometimes even millions of pounds doing, beavers will do completely free of charge. So they create really dynamic habitats, and that's why having these back in the landscape, having not been here for 400 years, is a really, really positive thing for conservation.
And another thing they do, I think there is a lot of fear, particularly amongst people who aren't necessarily in conservation circles, about that word flooding. What beavers do is they slow the flow of water, so they reduce the risk of flooding downstream from where they build their dams. So actually there's a lot of benefits. If they're in the right places, they can bring huge benefits to people as well as wildlife. What we should say about the beavers at Studland is that actually there was already 3 beavers in the landscape there when they released the legal ones, because they were beaver bombed. There was someone obviously got very impatient, and you can sympathise with this, really. A lot of people asked if it was Birds of Poole Harbour. It wasn't. But there are a lot of people nationally, locally, who were frustrated by the fact that we weren't getting these species back into the landscape quickly enough, and that can lead to these vigilante groups just going and chucking beavers out in the landscape. And that, positives and negatives, it created some difficulty for the National Trust and Natural England, because they didn't know anything about those individuals. They didn't know where they'd come from. You just have to hope and trust that the people knew what they were doing that did release them. But they have now had, is it 2 or 3 successful breeding seasons, though, that pair, and there's now 2 other pairs in the landscape as well. So and as part of this project, the National Trust and Natural England have also been asked to identify other potential sites for beaver releases within Poole Harbour and within the local catchment. So again, joined up thinking. They're not just thinking about one particular site. They're not just thinking about Littlesea. The intention is that these individuals and their offspring are going to spread across the landscape, that we're going to be able to reinforce that population with more individuals, and we're going to see a healthy restoration of beavers across the landscape.
So yeah, when it comes to species recovery and reversing those declines that we've heard about this morning, I think, I mean, what was it again? Say the nightingale decline total 90% in what year time? In 55 years. That is awful. I'm sorry, but that is awful. You can't really get your head around that amount of decline in that time period. And to be honest, we should be ashamed of ourselves, because it's not just nightingales. There's a whole range of things that have completely disappeared from our landscape in a very, very short space of time for a range of reasons. So we have to use every tool in the toolbox to try and get those species back, cater for new things that are arriving of their own accord, and to also boost baseline food systems and availability. So you have to use every method, okay? So we've just talked about 3 species: osprey, white-tailed eagle, and beaver. They are obviously targeted reintroductions to bring those species alone back. However, also within this landscape, right outside the marquee here, which has been working on for the last, decade or so, became the Purbeck Heaths Super National Nature Reserve. Now, for anyone that watched Spring Watch whilst it was at Arm, I think they were contractually obliged to say Super National Nature Reserve 30,000 times during the programme. But it's an important element to our landscape here, because it is delivering a whole range of really big benefits. Now, having grown up, I grew up in Upton, which is just up over here. We do have fragments of urban heath in and around Poole. So you've got Camford Heath, you've got Upton Heath, Bourne Valley Heath. And they are clinging on and they're doing okay, and there's good work going on. But the heathlands that are along the south of the harbour, that go all the way west into Purbeck as well, and obviously you've got the New Forests, I would argue the heathlands have actually never been in a better state down here. Back in the day when they were treated as wasteland, they were built on, they were developed, they weren't really given any special protection. They disappeared fast, and things like smooth snakes, Dartford warblers, sand lizards, nightjars all struggled. But the latest, I can't remember the exact figures, but the latest Dartford warbler and nightjar statistics for the Purbeck Heaths is that they are thriving and they are doing really, really, really well. And that is because quite an interesting change in attitude towards land management. So targeted reintroductions is one thing. Landscape scale land regeneration has to be the next big thing moving forward. And one of our trustees, Ian, told me a really interesting thing. He works for Natural England locally, and he's a massive advocate for all these things that are going on in this area. And he said, well, what's changed is the approach to land management. And he said, and he explained to me that what used to be the case going back 40 years ago, 50 years ago, that things were so dire that fences were put around remaining protected areas to protect what was in those areas. And that was kind of really the birth, essentially, to a certain degree, of nature reserves. That within the nature reserve, you would garden for nature. So you would protect the Dartford warblers, or you would protect the things that were within that fenced area. But of course, if everything beyond that fenced area is no good, all you're doing is just containing things that cannot expand into new territories, into new habitats, and into new areas. And so what happened was that all of the landowners in this south part of the harbour, so all the conservation NGOs, so National Trust, RSPB, Dorset Wildlife Trust, plus the council, Dorset Council, plus private sector landowners, so Careys Estate are part of not the NNR, but potentially Wareham Ark, but then also the Rempstone Estate, Forestry England. Everyone in this landscape signed up to the Purbeck Heaths NNR. And now all of this is all managed as one ginormous 6,500 hectare. I think with the Wareham Ark, it's 6,000. So, okay, the Purbeck Heaths NNR is 3,331. And it's working. It really is working. They've got a new livestock grazing regime out there. Anyone that's visited, in fact, I was driving past Soldiers Road yesterday, and all the blimmin' Mangalixa pigs were right in the middle of the road. But you can go to any part of the Purbeck Heath NNR now, or the Super NNR, and encounter different breeds of cattle, different breeds of donkey, different breeds of horse, the pigs that are all basically, this is kind of the rewilding methodology that they pioneered at Knepp, the Knepp estate, which is obviously a hugely successful rewilding project. Well, we're doing it right here in the harbour on a massive scale with all of the landowners. And it's, like I say, it's paying dividends now, that because, you know, populations of Dartfords and smooth snakes and whatnot, we've seen increases in tree pipit populations. The most stark one is, which can't quite see it on this map, well, about here, roughly, is an area called Wild Woodbury, which is a Dorset Wildlife Trust managed rewilding site. And when they took it on, only, what was it, 2022, wasn't it? So really not that long ago. It was either 2022 or 2023. It was an intensively farmed landscape with really not very much on it at all. I mean, it was deadly. But being so close to the heathland, and really good heathland, they've now rewilded that for 2 or 3 years, and when they censused last year, it had 17 pairs of tree pipit on it. You know, tree pipit being a red listed species that has been almost struggling as much as things like, you know, spotted flycatchers. So given the opportunity for these populations to expand into new areas, same with woodlark, it works, you know. So it's really great that all of the landowners in this landscape are now thinking together and not just thinking individually. And us as locals and environmentally, it's really starting to come together.
And the really key thing about this whole approach that they're taking is processes. So they're not trying to restore and preserve specific species. It's obviously that plays a part in it. There's some really rare and endemic species that are only found in Purbeck, that are found across this heathland complex. But equally, heathland itself is a successional habitat, which means it's partway between different habitat stages. It's not designed, well, not designed, nothing's designed, but it's not meant to stay permanent as it is heathland. It naturally wants to grow into something else, and that's usually when you get the encroachment of trees. And you can throw millions and millions and millions of pounds of trying to preserve heathland as it is, and it will not do it. So what's really important is actually restoring the processes that manage the landscape naturally, rather than having work parties going out and just repeatedly cutting down gorse all the time. Put out the livestock that are going to do that naturally, and would have historically done that for millennia before humans came into the landscape. The pigs are creating bare ground, which allows new plants to colonize. What we really need is some really big species to actually push through some of that vegetation, to browse down some of the larger vegetation. Bison. That's the next thing. And that is, to be honest, that is what they're working on and hoping for next.
Yeah, European bison.
That is on the cards for the Purbeck Heaths, because they'll eat the bracken, they'll push through all the trees, they'll rub up against trees and they'll push them over, and they'll create patches of new light for new growth to come through. They'll create a dynamic landscape, and that's exactly what we need. And it's so much easier to manage. So much of this is hands off. They have to manage the livestock in as much as they have to vet check them and things. The rest of it, they've put in the pig-proof fences. They were out a few times, and then they just let them roam within that. And we're learning from this as well. There's currently a PhD student who's doing his PhD with the National Trust, actually studying the behaviour of the grazers and what impacts they're having. So this is science in action in the landscape, that's going to have, help our understanding, but it's also going to have direct conservation implications as well.
I was just going to add one thing as well, that the biggest change, and it's still for a lot of individuals within organisations nationally, it's not just a local thing, is this skill, and it is a skill, to be able to let go and change the mentality of you must intervene at every moment to, like Brittany said, to maintain what has been over the last 40 years. I mean, I've had some great arguments with people. I mean, I think it was was it here or something just further down river, where a tree fell down and part into the river, and the farmer said, right, how are you going to get that out? You need to move it now. I thought, no. Why? What's the benefit? Oh, well, but we've always taken them out. Well, why? Well, I don't know. We just always have. And it's just that constant cleanup mentality, or that complete fear of not knowing how something might evolve. And it's always been really fascinating for me in the countryside, is that there is almost utter control on how things should be. And it is having that ability to let go, have a bit of faith in the process, and learn from what evolves, a year down the line, 10 years down the line, 50 years down the line. But that's what's really great about the Purbeck Heath Centre is that all of those people have accepted letting go and trialing something new.
And I think projects like that, a lot of the stuff that's happened locally is down to a very small number of people who've been working on it for a long time. Ian Alexander is a perfect example. He has dedicated his career to making these things come to fruition. But they do need higher level support as well. If you want to encourage farmers to change their practices and things, you need to be able to provide support for them, whether it's financial, whether it's knowledge based. And we're now starting to see this coming into funding streams that are available. And the most exciting one, Paul's just mentioned it, is the Weremark Landscape Recovery Project. So it's very similar to what's going on the Purbeck Heaths, with the exception that most of the Purbeck Heaths is already nature reserve. Most of the Weremark area, although you've got big areas, you've got Wareham Forest up in the middle here, you have got land that, like Careys, that's being managed for wildlife, but on the whole, a lot of these areas, certainly further up the river valleys, are being managed for farmland. And this project is going to bring together 25 different landowners in this landscape with government funding for up to 20 years. And that's really significant. If you speak to anyone who works in conservation and they tell you you've got funding for 20 years, you would not believe them, because it's so rare. But this is a really important recognition of scale. We're talking about big scale, spatial scales. We're also talking about time scales as well. We need to start thinking beyond just our own lifetimes, our own careers, but actually into the future and generations' time. What's the landscape going to look like, and how can we ensure that it's going to be suitable to support nature? And so there's a huge collaboration going on. It's currently under government review. DEFRA are deciding how much money they're going to be able to put towards it.
About 8p, I think, is the so far.
There are challenges along the way, but there is.
It's got 15 minutes.
Okay. But essentially, this is, again, if it comes to fruition, and it should, because they've put so much hard work into it locally, then there's going to be huge benefits for a lot of species, particularly if you're managing farmland well, like we have seen in recent years over the Purbeck coast. You'll start to see species like searle bunting coming back into the landscape. This is something that literally has just started happening after a very, very long time, decades. And they're an example of a species where if you create the habitat, they come back in on their own. And that's the other species on that slide was pine marten. Very different habitat requirements. They require these big blocks of woodland. There's been reintroductions done in some places, some legally, some illegally. But recently there was a pine marten seen on a camera trap just outside Sandford. And it was carrying a radio collar. And they had a look at the markings on the front of that individual, because you can tell from the white markings on the breast. And they worked out, they think that individual's probably come from a release on Dartmoor. And during lockdown as well, actually, back in 2020, a pine marten was captured on a live stream camera at Sandbanks, which is just about as far from the New Forest where it'd probably come as possible. But they probably followed those coniferous trees all the way down the coastline there. If you can provide that connectivity in the landscape, these species will find their way back in. And that's exactly what we're starting to see. When the landscape is being managed right, as a lot of the habitat locally has, particularly up on the coast, there's been a lot of improvements. Then you do start to get and see these species coming back into the landscape. Do we know where the unringed ospreys that are starting to turn up in the UK, where they've come from? The truth is, historically, all of the osprey chicks in the UK, almost all of them were ringed, because they were being very closely monitored and protected for conservation purposes, because unfortunately persecution was still a risk even when they started to return in the 60s and 70s. There was a lot of robbing of eggs from nests. It's this thing to be celebrated. The population in Scotland certainly is so big now that they're not able to actually get around all of the nests and ring all of the chicks. So there's a very good chance that the birds that we're seeing passing through the landscape, certainly here in the autumn in Poole Harbour, that are unringed, they probably are British birds. They're probably Scottish birds that they're in areas that unfortunately there's just not enough trained climbers and ringers and things. It's very specialist a process to actually, to do these scientific studies on these birds, and it's done under license as well. So you have to, they're a protected species ospreys. They're on what's called Schedule 1. So you have to have a license to disturb them at the nest site. And then also, obviously, you have to have the training to be able to ring them as well. So it's quite specialist. And we think that, bearing in mind, in 1954, there was one known osprey nest in the whole of Scotland and the whole of the UK. We now think there's probably over 350. That's a phenomenal conservation success story that really deserves to be celebrated. And a lot of that is down to people, actually. A lot of it is down to people protecting them. One of the things they did at Lochgarten, which I think really has provided a lot of inspiration for a lot of the osprey conservation around the country since then, is that George Waterston, who was head of the RSPB locally at the time, he invited people to come and see the ospreys at a time when they knew that there was only one known nest in the country, and they knew that they were at risk. If someone knew where that nest was, they were at risk of persecution. He was very heavily criticised for that at the time by his, fellow conservation staff, really. And then it turned out to be the best thing they could have possibly done, because I think in the first sort of 3 years that they opened that site up at Lochgarten to members of the public, each year they had over 10,000 people come. And that was in the late 1950s, early 1960s, going to right into the, Cairngorms National Park to go and see these birds. Ospreys and eagles and things, they're a really good example of quite an enigmatic species. They do draw that kind of interest. What we think, and what the Roy Dennis Wildlife Foundation think, and what a lot of other organisations think, is that we should capitalise on those opportunities. They do get criticised as vanity projects sometimes. We do hear that all the time, but we're using them. Not only are we restoring a species, but we're also hopefully using them to engage people with nature more broadly. And a lot of the people that come on our events to see ospreys come back again to come on our other events to see other wildlife that they've maybe never heard of before. So they are a very powerful tool.
Well, because it's important. I think context is everything, and we talk about this on the boats, and if you haven't been on the boats, it's a nice thing. So we do these boat trips through Birds of Poole Harbour where we've gone from doing 15 a year. This year we're doing 220. It's gone mad. There is no denying that obviously white-tailed eagles and ospreys are a part of that draw, and I'd say that we see, certainly during the calendar year, the eagles from about 90% of the trips. Ospreys during the season that they're here, we see from about almost 100% of the trips, because they're breeding locally. But when we're doing these trips, we're highlighting other examples of species recovery, of work that's been carried out several decades previous, where we're now beginning to see the benefits. And so they're things that I think people forget to kind of really think about. And one of them is marsh harrier. We do our boat trips and you come out and you see marsh harrier in the winter. We saw the other day 5, 6, 7, and we get up to kind of 25 roosting each evening. They were on the brink of extinction in this country in the mid-1960s. There were only 1 or 2 pairs left. They were being annihilated. DDT poisoning was destroying the eggs. Habitat was being lost. Egg collecting was still a thing, to the point where marsh harriers were clinging on. Okay, but then the reasons about their decline were understood. DDT got banned. The egg collecting kind of faded away. Habitats were reinstated. Better habitats were created, and as a result, we saw marsh harriers return. And it's so important, I think, that when you're out seeing these things, you're not just going, oh, what a lovely marsh harrier. You're actually beginning to remember why they are here and how they are here. And another great example is avocet. It's no coincidence that the avocet is the RSPB's logo bird. It's because it's a massive conservation success story. Going back to the kind of 40s or so, when only 1 pair were accidentally found breeding on a wet field in East Anglia, and then work was done to build up those populations, and a lot more was learnt about avocets at the time, and they're back in abundance, to the point where this year, now these won't all be UK avocets, I know for a fact they're not, because some come from Holland, some come from southwest France, they come from all over the place. But we had close to 2,000 avocets in Poole Harbour this winter during our December Webbs count. And go back to when Webbs counts began, Webbs being wetland bird surveys, which were managed by the BTO centrally. We used to get 5 avocets in the harbour. So within a 3-hour time period out on the boats, we can show people breeding ospreys. We can show people, white-tailed eagles in the landscape. We can show people huge flocks of 2,000 avocet. We can show people marsh harriers flying around and show them multiple examples of why and how species recovery is achieved. And we're beginning to see new colonizers as a result of warming temperatures and as a result of recovering populations of things that disappeared hundreds of years ago. Little egret, for example, bred for the first time in Dorset in 1996, was the first time in this country in 1996 on Brownsea Island. They are now widespread. They're a bird that was absolutely annihilated for their plumes, going back a few centuries. But with an expanding range and recovering populations, little egret started establishing. And we're now beginning to see the same for great white egret, which are now doing very well in parts of England, on various wetlands. And now cattle egret. In fact, I could take you for a walk in about 30 seconds and show you 50 cattle egret that are overwintering out on the floodplains here next door to Careys. We've also got an overwintering flock of glossy ibis. What a change of circumstance is that? And it's quite interesting that when we do these boat trips, that we're showing people not only the wintering birds but these new colonizing birds. And I've got a good feeling that glossy ibis will probably make a breeding attempt in Dorset this year. 1,200 arrived in September last year. This big eruption of birds that came up from Spain, settled in southern Britain, have kind of distributed themselves across certain areas. So we've given you lots of examples of all the things that are going on, but we obviously don't want to stop. We think there are things that we can progress with, and things where we can have an impact, and it's a bit that Brittany's been working on for the last kind of 3 or so years, isn't it?
So our next species is red-billed chough. And I think the thing about red-billed chough, again, is probably, they're not necessarily the highest conservation priority. It depends what metrics you're using, actually, because a lot of chough populations in the UK are declining. And there's some people that would argue we need to be, helping to restore those populations. And I agree, we absolutely do. But we also need to work where there's opportunity. And locally here, we have a lot of very good quality habitat for chough. It's the only thing we're missing in the landscape here for chough is the choughs themselves. And we would very much like to see them back in the landscape, and we think that to wait for them to get back into the landscape by themselves is going to take a very long time. In fact, we modelled it and it was predicted to be somewhere between 35 to 80 years for them to get back into the landscape, whilst we have some very well managed farmland habitat that's excellent for them. Which is really the main factor that's actually driving their decline elsewhere, we think, is actually availability of food and a decreasing amount of traditional grazing practices, where it's sort of less intensive farming, certainly less intensive use of worming treatments in cattle. Dung is a really important food source for chough, and so we have a vast amount of suitable habitat up on the Purbeck coast. The National Trust have been working really well with their tenant farmers to try and reduce the amount of inputs onto that land that could have a negative impact, not just on chough, but so many species. And they're a really good flagship for these sort of short sward natural grasslands, of which we've got quite a lot in Purbeck. So we're gonna try and do something about that. We've written a feasibility study about restoring chough to Purbeck using birds from Cornwall and South Wales, translocating them into the landscape, releasing them. It's a little bit different to ospreys and white-tailed eagles. Chough are a very sociable species. It's one of the reasons they don't spread very quickly, but it also means that the way that they use the landscape once they've fledged is very much influenced by other individuals. So they will learn traditional foraging areas from other birds. So if we're putting them back into a brand new landscape, we need to support them until they've developed those traditions for themselves. So we're going to have to support them a little longer than, certainly longer than the ospreys, 14 weeks and they're gone, and that's it. We don't see them again for 2 years. So the chough are going to need a little bit more of a helping hand. But we think it's certainly a worthwhile investment. And one of the things we want to do is also make that process a bit cheaper, because there's a couple of projects that have been done in Kent and Jersey. People might have been to see chough up there, but they use a captive rearing process, which is actually one of the most expensive bits, is actually breeding the chough themselves. And you're selecting from a very small gene pool there. So our thinking is that increase some genetic diversity, speed up the recovery along the south coast, provide a stepping stone population between those two populations and the Cornish population and the South Wales population, is not only going to bring benefits for chough in the landscape here, but also hopefully across the whole of the south of England. So there is an application currently with Natural England. People aren't very keen to give us their chuff at the moment, are they? That's our main barrier at the moment, is persuading people to relinquish their chuff a little. And we're only asking for a very small number. It'll probably be about 12 individuals per year for 5 years. But the Cornish population is expanding exponentially at the moment, which is really encouraging. And it means that actually you can take a few individuals out of the population. It has very limited impact on the population you're taking from. And obviously we wouldn't want to do it if we were going to have a negative impact where we were taking the birds from. But we think there's a real opportunity here, not only to help restore a species, but also to improve translocation practices for a species, and also to connect people to a landscape that, there's many people who live in Swanage or Wareham. They've never been up to the Purbeck coast. They've never walked through that habitat and seen all that it has to offer, not just chough, but all of the insect diversity, bats, all these things, the seabirds breeding on the cliff. Restoring chough is hopefully going to benefit all of those things as well, and benefit the people within the local landscape as well, and restore some heritage that we've lost historically. There's a lovely, lovely record that we found that seems to indicate that chough once bred on Corfe Castle, and we think that would be, there's peregrines there now. So they may not breed there successfully, but there's jackdaws breeding at Corfe Castle. I like to think maybe one day in the next 10 years we might have chough breeding there again as well.
What is important with all of this, and I think what we've really proven over the last 5 years, is the public response is huge, and I think far bigger and more important and influential than we ever realised. I think there is a public need and want for a healthier landscape, and those iconic species like an osprey, like an eagle, really helps bring all of that to life, because actually sometimes it can be hard to get your head around and it can be hard to experience and see, but seeing an eagle beating up an osprey stealing its fish is, for me, the greatest example of proactive nature conservation. So I said at the start, I think there's certain things that need to change. I think one of our biggest problems as a conservation loving country is the fact that we're an island. I think when we lose species, a lot of things find it very, very hard to make that jump to want to start breeding again. There's a great example. Anyone caught the ferry from Poole to Cherbourg? What's that, 3.5 ferry ride? You get off the ferry at Cherbourg, there are turtle doves everywhere, there are seal buntings everywhere, there are melodious warblers singing, there's fan-tailed warblers in and that's all just 3 hours south of us. Now, some of those things will start eventually expanding their range north, but it can take a long time. And I think we have a duty where, if possible, and certainly if humans have been the reason why things have disappeared, and taking into account all the things Chris said earlier about the rate and the speed of declines, why wouldn't you do something fast and now if there's an opportunity and it's going to have ecosystem benefits, human benefits, and economic benefits? Okay, and so we've linked up with Bournemouth University and we're doing a nice bit of research looking at the economic benefits, that all the things that we've talked about so far, all of those things combined, what impacts they're having. For me personally, I don't know about you, Britt, it's not about eagles, it's not about ospreys. If it was something else, I'd be just as focused and determined, because what it is, it's using case studies, lots and lots of case studies as to why this is important, what the people benefits and responses are. And we're very lucky, actually our local MP to here has been very supportive as well. So what we're trying to prove is across the range that all of this stuff should be rolled out en masse, if possible, in lots and lots of different areas. And we are having an impact. Over this last year, we've had cluster organisations from all over the country, some from Northumberland, some from Cornwall, some from the east as well, who have brought their teams onto one of our boat trips so they can kind of see and hear all the things that we've just talked about, so that they can go back to their teams in those areas and say, God, you should see what's going on in Purbeck. They've got this going on, they've got this going on, they've got this going on, they've got this. And so we just build up momentum, and it is all about momentum. And so we've made a little list of things that need to kind of happen. We need less apathy. apathy kills conservation. There is so much debate, so much talking crap, basically, excuse my language, about why things shouldn't happen, when actually, if you work with the right people and the finances there, just get on with it. So less apathy and less bureaucracy. Honestly, what's a camel is a horse designed by committee? Have you ever heard of that? Yeah, I mean, that is conservation in a nutshell. You can have a group of people working on something and know how to do it and will have an outcome, but before you know it, 30 organisations have got involved, 10 years has passed, and it still hasn't blimmin' happened. So less bureaucracy, less fear. I think there's a lot of fear in conservation. People are scared because of what the public might say or what lobby groups might say. And actually, sod it, you've just got to do it. Like I say, if it's legal, if it's cost effective, and it's and it's the right thing to do, then just crack on and do it. Don't be scared. Less snobbery. Honestly, the snobbery in conservation. If I ever hear the words plastic or vanity project or any of those things about the things that people are working on, it's hard work doing these projects, and to just get your work rubbished because someone can't tick an osprey because it's been released as part of a project, I don't care. So there needs to be less snobbery in the conservation sector. More belief, more leadership, more trust between allies, more speed. Things need to be more cost effective, a much broader perspective. The momentum is the key one. Interpret well. I hope that anyone that's been out on our trips, and even from this talk this morning, that you get an understanding of what's possible and why it's important, and all of those successes need to be interpreted well, to invite the public to be part of that success. And that was the last one we came up with, because that's crucial. Everyone plays a role in how these things pan out. Your voice, your interests. And I don't want to end the talk on actually, I won't end the talk on a negative, but it's not negative at all. It's a huge positive. Do not underestimate the health benefits this all has as well. It's quite a selfish human way to look at it, to say, well, let's release some ospreys because it makes me feel better. That isn't why we do it. We do it for the species and for them to recover. But honestly, the comments that we have from the public that either come to hear Carey or come out on the boats, or that is unbelievable. And we had a guest on board a few months ago, last summer, and just sat on the boats like this. It was exactly like this. This is how the boats are laid out. And a guy came up through the central aisle at the end of the trip, and we'd had a magic trip. We'd seen the ospreys flying around, we'd seen the eagles flying around. And he came up and he shook my hand and he goes, I just want to say thanks. I had a suicide attempt 2 years ago and these saved me. And you hear that, and it is a kick in the guts. It really is, because it shows that the hard work that you're putting into all of this, everybody, not just Birds of Poole Harbour, but everyone that's working so hard to make things better, is having those kinds of impacts. And we get lots of emails from people, don't we?
One of my favourite ones is we have the Osprey web camera on the nest here at Carey, and it makes the wildlife accessible to a whole other group of people that couldn't, we have people watching it in Australia, but also I've had people who have been bedridden for 6 months come up to me and say, watching that web camera got me through that really hard period. We had a teacher who works with special educational needs students who said, I put on that web camera every morning for my class, and it has such a calming effect on the students that other teachers have asked me what it is I'm doing to help those children. Oh, it's going to make me cry, honestly. It's just like Paul said, it's never the main driver behind what we're doing, but it's such a positive consequence of it. And I think if we can do more to actually recognise those benefits as well, I think it does become a big argument for a lot of the things we're talking about.
Yeah. And, the thing you hear all the time is, it's always the big sexy species, white storks, ospreys, eagles. Well, the truth is, in the grand scheme of things, reintroductions are still not a new concept, but you think that reintroductions, going back to the 60s when the first white-tailed eagle reintroduction, there's still so much to learn, so much important stuff to learn. And the new understandings will come. And it wouldn't surprise me at all if over the next decade there are methods to learn willow tit reintroductions or lesser spotted woodpecker reintroductions or something to increase those populations. But for now, what we know and what we understand is that we have to act, and by using things like the species that the science has been worked out on how to do things successfully, then we just need to crack on and do it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.